Ariel. So today I want to talk about a very interesting and fascinating lost and canceled subject. That is the first version of the Fantastic Four film by Marvel Studios, the original version that was going to be directed by John Watts, the guy who did the MCU Spider Man films to much success, and kind of discuss what this project could have been, the history of it, and why he ultimately left the project, and we would eventually get the film that we're currently getting at the time I'm making this video with Matt Shackman. So, to give a little history, after Disney bought Fox, Marvel acquired the Fantastic Four rights. And during kind of an investor's call in 2020, when the pandemic was raging, they would announce a bunch of future Marvel projects. And one of the major ones was the Fantastic Four film. They announced that they were going to finally start work on it. They kind of presented this flashy preliminary logo for the film. Very cool, like I said, flashy with blue light, kind of symbolizing and combining into a four for the film. They also announced that John Watts was going to be the director of this new Fantastic Four film. At the time, John Watts had directed the previous two MCU Spider Man films, and he was deep into filming and post production for No Way Home. So it seemed like a surefire hit and a good choice to get him to direct the Fantastic Four film, especially since Marvel was so confident in him. Eventually, he would wrap up No Way Home, and the film would be immensely successful, making I think 1.9 billion. And like I said, this was during a pandemic too, even more impressive. So after his Spider-Man trilogy wrapped up, now, like I said, Fantastic Four was the next film that we start work on. Scripting, pre-production, all these things need to start coming together. And it seemed like this is where John Watts in this version of the movie would kind of fall apart. And eventually in 2022, it was announced that he left the project. Now, particularly why he left the project was kind of unclear. There was a lot of speculation over the years. But just kind of in a recent interview, he kind of gave more explanation and clarity onto why he left the project. And the basic reason, just to sum it up, is that he felt like he was out of gas. He was burnt out of doing all these Marvel movies, and he felt like that he couldn't give his energy properly and his creativity enough to get this film done properly, right? He also added that the COVID layer of making the No Way Home film under the huge restrictions of the pandemic was extremely stressful for him, and doing that all over again with Fantastic Four would have been extremely hellish for him. So, like I said, it was mostly the fact that he felt burnt out. He was out of steam, out of gas. He couldn't really commit himself to another massive Marvel film, which makes sense, right? He was doing back-to-back Spider-Man films with really only 2-year breaks between them. So, obviously, I would feel a little burnt out, especially in that situation. And also, making a gigantic film like Fantastic Four in the pandemic would have been also extremely difficult. And the whole situation of making No Way Home under the pandemic restrictions and the COVID issues obviously factored into his decision of leaving the project as well. Now, what could have been the John Watts Fantastic Four? We really don't know. We only have really this logo and just speculation, right? We don't know actually how far he got into this version of the Fantastic Four and what it could have been. But I'm going to give you my ideas and some hypothetical scenarios that could have been John Watts' Fantastic Four. So the first thing is I do believe this film would have been set in the modern day. Looking back on John Watts' previous Spider-Man films and kind of like what the logo kind of suggests, this would have been a more modern day take on the Fantastic Four. It would have been set in the main timeline 616, and it just would have introduced the Fantastic Four in the modern day MCU. So kind of like most of the MCU movies, right? I also think that, and this is just complete speculation, there was a lot of fan castings going on around the time. It was like a huge online swirl of people just making their own fan castings of the Fantastic Four, who would play the four, right? And there was a lot of popular ones. You had like Adam Driver playing Mr. Fantastic and Margot Robbie playing the Invisible Woman. And while, like I said, this is all completely fan castings and speculation, I do feel like if John Watts was attached to the film, I do feel like some of these fan castings might have actually happened. Just to suggest more of the tone they were going to go for and more of this modern day take, they were going to try with Fantastic Four. Now, like I said, all complete speculation. I'm just making things up, but I have a hunch that's what it kind of most likely been like. I do think, too, this just would have been a more conventional Marvel film. It would have been shot more conventionally. It just would have been a film set in the modern-day MCU timeline. And it definitely would have been, like I said, probably a film that would have pleased a lot of people. But I don't think the film would have stand out compared to something like the film that we're getting now, which it had this very unique, retro futuristic 60s world in an alternate universe that really screams creativity, and it like sets the Fantastic Four apart from a lot of the other MCU films that are going on right now. It's actually a really cool selling point for that film that we're going to get with Matt Shakman coming out this week at the time I'm making this video. So that's what my overall hypothetical, my quick opinions of what this film could have been. Obviously, as we all know, he left the project. Matt Shakman was brought on with some new writers and eventually would craft the film that we're currently getting, Fantastic Four: First Steps, which, I'm very excited to see, and hopefully it turns out pretty good. Now, what my overall opinion on Jon Watts' Fantastic Four could have been, and would I prefer this version of the movie? Well, it's kind of too early to say anything, but while I do like Jon Watts as a director, and he definitely moved on after he left this project to do Wolves with Brad Pitt and George Clooney, which I haven't seen, but I've heard it's pretty all right. I do think that this was ultimately probably for the best. I think Jon Watts was a very talented filmmaker. He did make a lot of really good MCU Spider-Man films and handled that trilogy pretty well. But I don't think he had enough creative energy to make a Fantastic Four film that would have been really good. And I think he just kind of in my opinion, he just would have made more of a standard affair with the Fantastic Four, more of a modern day take on it. Nothing too crazy, probably with some conventional stakes, maybe smaller villains, just nothing too crazy. Like, I doubt Galactus would have been hit in his version of the movie. It probably would have been some smaller villain like the Mole Man or something. So overall, I think from what I can infer and what I've seen of this new Fantastic Four, I think this was ultimately the best decision. I am still fascinated what could have been the Jon Watts version of Fantastic Four, but ultimately, that's, like I said, that's what the reality is. We never got to see what this version was, and maybe that was for the best. Overall, this is my quick video about the canceled and lost version of Fantastic Four, Jon Watts' Fantastic Four. Hope you all like this quick video. Peace. Have a nice day.